So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Graduate Institute this evening. My name is Claire Somerville, and I'm the Executive Director of the Gender Centre here at the Graduate Institute, and we are delighted, together with the Governance Centre, to co-host this evening's event. We're really thrilled. We've actually had a workshop all day, and on the top of this, we are thrilled that two of our participants, in fact, have agreed to join us this evening for this public event. Professor Jill Steens from the University of Birmingham and Professor Cynthia Weber from the University of Sussex on what I think you will agree, and probably why you're here, is an extraordinarily interesting topic. And we very much look forward to hearing from Cynthia this evening. I will now pass over to Jill, who's going to chair this evening's session. And again, I thank you for coming, and have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming. As Claire said, my name's Jill Steens. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Birmingham, where I have a special interest in gender issues. And I'm delighted this evening to welcome you to this keynote lecture by Professor Cynthia Weber, or Cindy, who's currently Professor of International Relations at Sussex University. It's a little bit scary, but when I was preparing this presentation, I had to think about how long I'd known you. And I've actually known Cindy for something like 25 years now, I think, during which time Cindy's made an immense contribution towards scholarship in international relations, feminist studies in international relations and queer theory, again, within the discipline of international relations and in American studies. Cindy's the author of several highly regarded books, including Simulating Sovereignty, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1995, Imagining America at War, Routledge 2006, I Am an American, Filming the Fear of Difference, Intellect Books 2011, and most recently, 2016, Queer International Relations, Sovereignty, Sexuality, and the Will to Knowledge, which is published by Oxford University Press. During her academic career, Cindy has held a number of fellowships in the UK and the USA, including the University of Southern California, New School University, the University of Arizona, the University of Wales at Aberystwyth, and Queen's University Belfast. You may not know this, but Cindy is also a filmmaker and film producer of some repute, and her excellent collection of short films on US citizenship and identity, entitled I Am an American, Video Portraits of Post-9/11 US Citizens, forms part of the permanent collection in the September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City. Cindy has a very long-standing commitment to public engagement on major policy issues and the policy challenges of our time, and she's going to speak tonight to just one such policy issue, an issue which may indeed, as Cindy has said herself, be one of the most important issues of our time. And this is the subject of artificial intelligence and the import for international policy, not least in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Cindy's going to speak for around about 40 minutes on this subject, and then she will take some questions from the audience in the time remaining. So without further ado, Cindy? Thanks. Over to you.
Jill, do you want to sit next to
Yep, I'll move around here.
Wow. I don't know all those things about me, so that was pretty cool. Thank you, Jill. Always too generous. Thank you, Claire, for inviting me, and the folks from the Governance Center as well, Annabelle and Nico. One of the books that wasn't mentioned, and I'm only going to plug it, because my co-author works here at the Institute, is another book I did on sovereignty with Tom Bierstecker. So that was one of my favorite projects, because Tom's so, he's great. I also want to thank Christine, Ruth, and Kazu for all the paperwork and emails that went into getting me here. So thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming, and especially some of the participants from today's workshop, which was really fascinating. So my presentation is going to begin a bit weird because, you know, I'm here. So it begins exactly like this. Look at me. Look closer. Am I straight? Am I gay or lesbian? How do you know? A Stanford University study by Yulin Wang and Michael Kaczynski that recently went viral repackages long discredited beliefs that a person's face is scientifically readable for specific personality traits. Oh, and I have to remember to use my slides. There we go. This is a slide from their study. The study claims that artificial intelligence, and I'm going to use the terms, by the way, artificial intelligence is AI, and later I'll talk about AGI as well, which is artificial general intelligence. So that's superhuman, smarter than us, and AI is as smart as us, maybe. So the study claims that AI facial recognition technology can determine a person's sexual orientation with up to 30% greater accuracy than the human eye. The study analyzed more than 35,000 images on a US dating website. I mean, great source of material, right? It gets worse. Of white, able-bodied, 18 to 40-year-old cisgendered people for fixed and transient facial features. Now, this is incredible. Fixed facial features are things like nose shape, and transient facial features are things like grooming styles, weight, and facial expression. Researchers compared their AI-generated sexual orientations against sexual orientations the researchers found in dating profiles, which the researchers established, and I'm quoting their study, based on the gender of the partners that website users were looking for. Sounds reliable to me. Not. Now, it's not surprising at all that LGBTQ advocacy organizations immediately labeled the study junk science. And this was for many, many reasons, many of you have probably already read about. I mean, I've already talked a bit about how skewed the sample is in terms of race and age and ability and gender and location, right? You had to be in the US and you also had to be online. There are lots of coding biases in this study. For example, the study restricts the range of sexual orientations, sexes, and genders to neat yet inaccurate binaries, gay and straight, male and female, masculine and feminine. The study also mistakenly equates sexual orientation with sexual activity, even though people who have same-sex sex do not necessarily identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer. Fascinatingly, the coders of the study failed to independently verify crucial information, including the crucial category of sexual orientation, which are things that people often lie about or experiment with on dating websites. And they also confused what is natural with what is cultural. They treated transient facial features as if they are natural or native to gay culture and straight culture, rather than understanding them as performative acts that are highly dependent upon context. That's a lot wrong with this study. So the result is that this study's AI algorithm only finds what it was programmed to find: stereotypes about straights, gays, and lesbians. So why am I talking about it tonight if it's so horrible? If it gets so much wrong? Why is it my point of departure for a consideration of the implications of AI for UN SOGI policies? And why, more generally, should academics, activists, and policymakers care about this study? Well, elsewhere, I've argued that whether or not AI works and whether or not AI applications are based on good science or junk science, interventions like the Stanford study matter, because they are a part of a modern, especially Western tradition of categorizing people in terms of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And these categorizations have implications, especially for SOGI minoritized people. We spoke a lot about classifications today in our workshop. Global governance research demonstrates that often suspect assumptions about the so-called heterosexual versus the so-called homosexual have historically been intertwined with theories and policies about development, immigration, public health, security, human rights, and regional and international integration. This presumed knowledge about sexual subjects can benefit people whose sexual orientation and/or gender identities make them the most vulnerable to a range of risks and dangers, from discrimination to death. But the historical record shows that it is more likely to put some or all of these minoritized people at greater risk and in more danger. My argument today, and generally about in this piece, is that there is no reason to believe that the presumed knowledge about so-called gays and straights generated by artificial intelligence facial recognition technology will not itself create maybe some new opportunities, but also new risks and dangers for these very same people. So what might these new opportunities, risks, and dangers be? Well, that depends on three things: on how you think about AI, on how you think about SOGI issues, and on how they're put together in the real world. So how do we think about AI? There are at least three dominant narratives out there at the moment about artificial intelligence. This one is about what I call the fear narrative. This is one that argues that what actors are doing in international politics is striving to increase their power, to increase their security based on their interests, and that this can lead to, that when states get interested in artificial intelligence, it's now become a kind of Sputnik moment, right, the arms race. And we have Elon Musk here tweeting about how this could lead to World War III. In contrast to that, we have what I call the AI hope narrative. And those of you who, I don't know if anyone went to the ITU's Global AI for Good Global Summit this summer in Geneva. I wasn't fortunate enough to go. Is anyone here from that organization? You want to out yourself if you're here? No. I want to talk to you if you are, because I really want to follow up. These images come from the magazine that talked about that event. And here the assumptions are that we're in a more cooperative, we have a more cooperative understanding of politics, where an international community led by moral values is trying to work for the greater good. And so this is how the greater good, of course translated in UN terms, is about achieving sustainable development goals. Okay? And then we also have a third narrative, which I call the freedom narrative, which is always, like, why is it always housework? Like, seriously? Which is actually one of the things that AI is the worst at, because housework, contrary to what many people think, is an incredibly creative endeavor, and AI is terrible at creative endeavors. But this narrative is about achieving freedom. It's the favored narrative of entrepreneurial individuals, techno-entrepreneurs, who are very sort of, this is the sort of Silicon Valley crowd. What they're interested in is escaping the kinds of burdens of routine work, but also escaping the political governance of states. So that's the kind of way this freedom narrative works. So those are the sort of three dominant narratives about AI. We also, of course, have several dominant narratives about SOGI as well. We have what I would talk about as the SOGI proponents narrative, which I think would cover, I'm assuming, many people here, who talk about, who have a sort of an understanding of usually the figure of the LGBTI as a normal person who's in need of protection. That's opposed by the SOGI opponents narrative, which basically says, well, no, actually, that figure is not a normal human being. That figure is abnormal. And you know who needs protection? Society needs protection. Normal society needs protection from the LGBT. So how we mix these kinds of, these various narratives about AI and these various narratives about SOGI together and materialize them in the real world is how we get to an understanding of what the potential opportunities, risks, and dangers might be of AI for SOGI issues. With all of that in mind, what I want to do today is four things. I want to present one of the most influential AI hope narratives that's shaping AI conversations today. I want to secondly point out its compatibilities, but also potential incompatibilities with the SOGI proponents narrative. I want to read these two narratives together to consider the implications of AI for UN SOGI policies, for UN SOGI issues. And I'm going to stick with the illustration of AI-generated sexual orientations. And I'm doing this not because I think that this is the most important thing that's happening or that it is generalizable, not at all. But it is happening, and I don't think we should ignore it. So I'm not going to ignore it tonight. And I'm going to use that illustration to then outline some of the opportunities, risks, and dangers that AI presents for UN SOGI policies, and end up with proposing some actions and questions that might guide a UN-wide discussion on AI in the context of SOGI. So those are my coming attractions. My AI hope narrative comes largely from the work of Max Tegmark. I don't know how many of you have read this book, Life 3.0. Yeah. Gripping, fascinating, lots of things wrong with it at the same time. But defining the AI hope narrative. This is a book that's been on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks now. It's a very compelling read, at least it was for me. So and Tegmark is a MIT physics professor, and what he does in this book is he offers one of the most interesting and influential AI hope narratives that's currently in circulation. And in doing that, he makes the case for what he calls the beneficial AI movement, which has attracted the attention of the likes of Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk. So notice that Elon kind of goes from fear to hope and fear to hope, right? And that's not uncommon in these narratives. So Tegmark's hope narrative goes like this. AI could be the best thing, or it could be the worst thing to happen to humanity. So our best hope narrative, our best hope is to be mindfully optimistic. In other words, we need to have the expectation that good things will happen if we plan carefully and work hard for them. So this is what has led Tegmark and his colleagues to back beneficial AI. So what is that? Well, beneficial AI, the beneficial AI movement, is about building safety mechanisms into AI before it is operational at a human level, so AI, or at a general machine level, AGI, like way smarter than us, so smart we don't understand how it works, okay? And what Tegmark argues very convincingly in his book is that to do this entails more than just solving technical problems. It entails solving ethical issues so that human ethics can be programmed into machines as part of AI governing algorithms. Now, there are a lot of contentious assumptions about politics, science, evolution, the mathematical universe, which is the title of Tegmark's earlier book, intelligence and rationality that frame Tegmark's mindful optimism that I'm not going to bother to discuss tonight. I'm just going to concede. Let's just say he's right about all of his assumptions. It's just easier, okay? Although, by the way, like science and technology study has critiqued pretty much every one of them, but let's just give him those for the moment. Even if we grant Tegmark all of his assumptions, this is where Tegmark ends up. He's asking humans who have failed to collectively resolve their basic dilemmas about what it means to be human, about what it means to act ethically, even about what it means to be alive. There's a fascinating discussion on that in the book. To solve these non-mathematical problems so that they can be written up as algorithmic rules to guide future AI and especially AGI. Now that's an incredibly tall order, and I can make an argument for why I actually think it's an impossible thing to do. But Tegmark is a very, very, very smart guy. And so he's like, look, this is a order, so we need some guidelines. So this is where he and his colleagues came up and rollout of beneficial AI. Now I'm going to come back to those principles, a couple of those principles later in my talk. But for the moment, my point is just this, that Tegmark's hope narrative about AI is less about his hope in AI or his hope in AGI than it is in his hope that we humans will keep AI and AGI safe for humans. So where does Tegmark leave us? I don't know if anybody recognizes that image. That image was the background image for the ITU's AI for Good global conference, global summit this summer. And where Tegmark leaves us is with the human hand at the center of the AI hope narrative, okay? Just as it is in the background image here. I love that image. I want to meet the person who designed that image. I think that's very, very smart. So, what does this mean for, what does this AI hope narrative mean, what are its implications for AI SOGI issues? Well, as I said earlier in my talk, that depends on what your SOGI narrative is. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to stick with the SOGI proponents narrative. In a UN context, the SOGI proponents narrative fits within a general hope narrative, right? Which is about an international community engaging in moral action for the greater good. The SOGI proponents narrative also makes some additional assumptions, which I mentioned earlier, right? That LGBTI people are normal human beings, that they have the right to have rights, but that those rights, including sometimes the right to go on living, are things that need protection. Excuse me. So protecting people on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity is a UNHCR mandate, and it's an aim of many UN organizations. From that brief discussion, I think you can see that the SOGI proponents narrative maps easily onto the AI hope narrative. And it does this for a couple of reasons. It puts us exactly where Tegmark's beneficial AI narrative puts us, right? We're back here, with the human hand at the center of this hope narrative. And it lets us extend some of the ITU's work on achieving SDGs through AI, as we begin to think about what the opportunities for AI for good might be in the context of SOGI. Now, I'm going to go on now to talk about the opportunities, risks, and dangers of AI for SOGI issues. I have to warn you, I'm incredibly pessimistic. Trying to get the opportunities slide together took probably longer than the rest of the talk, okay? But I gave it a go. So these are a couple of things that I came up with. One of the things about AI is it's supposed to benefit everyone, right? It's designed to benefit everyone. And if you have a chance to look at the ITU's magazine about the AI for Good Global Summit, there's some fascinating articles in there that describe the kind of good that AI could potentially do. For example, it might increase food production by using crop intelligence, or it could unlock the benefits of food molecules to promote human health. So that's great. I'm all for that. But of course, who benefits from AI depends on how benefits are distributed, just as they do in any kind of situation like this. So I try to think, try to be positive, Cindy. Try to be positive. It's like, okay, so if we could algorithmically identify people on the basis of SOGI, then maybe, could we ensure that SOGI minoritized people also share in these AI benefits? Could this be a way of supporting the UNHCR's mandate? Or maybe how AI benefits are distributed might become another measure in the UNDP's proposed, now taking place, LGBTI Inclusion Index. Could it be something that spills over in a positive way to fields like hate crime prevention and help asylum seekers on the basis of SOGI? Those are all question marks because I'm very pessimistic about whether or not those things are achievable. Because I think there are lots of risks and dangers around AI for SOGI policy, and I think some of these risks and dangers come out of the dilemmas that SOGI proponents are faced with on any issue. And as it turns out, we spoke about a lot of these in our workshop today. One of those issues is the dilemma of classification. So how classification has historically harmed many SOGI minoritized people. If we talk about a kind of society organized around what gets called heteronormativity, where opposite sex relationships and social relations around those are normal, nearly all SOGI minoritized people experience some kind of bias or harm in that system. When we move to homonormativity, which says, well, no, now there are some good gays, not everybody, but there are some good gays, and so they're as normal as we are, and they belong in society, then some SOGI minoritized people end up not being harmed or as harmed, depends on what the terms of inclusion are, but still others are harmed. And because there are huge local and national disparities in how SOGI minoritized people are understood and treated, even these so-called good gays are at risk, depending on where they are or who they happen to meet. Another dilemma, though, of course, is that even with all of the problems of classification, classification can have policy benefits, which is, I think, why so many of us were struggling with this today. So, for example, the long struggle for recognition of LGBTIs supports the long struggle for rights for LGBTIs. How do you give people rights if you don't know who those people are? At the same time, recognition of LGBTIs has increased their visibility, which at times has increased their vulnerability. So consider, for example, the long history of scapegoating SOGI minoritized people for everything from terrorist attacks to military failures, to aid conditionality, to natural disasters. What would happen if we now are in a situation where AI is operating to try to determine people's sexual orientations? Could this actually further endanger SOGI minoritized people by changing the ways that scapegoating works? So instead of saying, oh, it's the fault of the gays, it's like, look, it's your fault, or it's your fault, and I know for sure what your sexual orientation is, and therefore I have the right to, beat you up or kill you or put you in jail or whatever. These kinds of dilemmas fold directly into the risks of SOGI. And I've got a long list of risks. I just want to focus for the moment on the risk of culture becomes nature. When AI venture capitalists comment excitedly about, and I quote them here, the convergence in biological and digital existences, they often fail to note how dubiously the biological is understood and algorithmically coded. In the Stanford study on AI-generated sexual orientations, for example, cultural indicators like grooming styles were coded as part of the evidence of biological differences amongst gay and straight people. As Wang and Kaczynski put it in their study, and I'm actually quoting them here, gay men and women tend to have gender atypical facial morphology, expression, and grooming styles, okay, huge assumptions there, but that are, and this is the kicker, that are consistent with the prenatal hormonal theory of sexual orientation, okay? Seriously, is my hair this short because my hormones made me do it, or my genes made me do it? I mean, So, now, there are lots of debates about the prenatal hormonal theory of sexual orientation. There are lots of debates about whether biologically determinate arguments about sexual orientation or culturally determinate ones are better for SOGI minoritized people. I know that. But my point here is that at a time when leaders in the field of merging biology with AI claim that, and this is another quote, biological insights deliver precision, but AI eliminates uncertainty. Okay, the little hairs on the back of my short haircut stand up when I find that one. So at a time when AI presumably eliminates uncertainty, AI applications can convince us that we know who someone is for sure, even when our biological data, like what our genes or hormones presumably indicate about our sexual orientation, is actually superficial cultural data, like how Cindy cuts her hair. Now, if cultural practices like around sexual orientations are elevated to the level of natural biology, then I think we start to get into these other kinds of risks as well, that everything becomes an indicator of sexual orientation or gender identity, that we lose any kind of spectrum around that. And all of this is made possible because in the current legal context, a person's face is considered to be public information. Okay, so there's no law that protects you from having your face read, and then how your face read and how that data is interpreted, this is what can happen. Which brings me to dangers. I've got lots and lots of these too. Is this just the three? I can't remember. No, that's not. So I'm going to skip that slide. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about these three dangers. I think one of the biggest dangers that potentially faces us in terms of AI and SOGI issues is one that we probably don't think of as a danger at all, which is that we assume, and that's why it's the most dangerous, I think, is that we could assume that SOGI goals and the goals of beneficial AI are always aligned. So I want to explain that and explain why I think that's not necessarily the case. So let's go back to Max Tegmark. Tegmark and his colleagues came up with a similar principles to ensure that the safety of humans in the future, of a possible human-level intelligence or superhuman AGI. Now, these principles, I want to suggest, are insufficient to ensure the safety and protection of people who are right now minoritized on the basis of SOGI. So let me just make that case by just looking at two principles, two of these similar principles. Principle 11 is called human values, and it goes like this, and I quote, "AI systems should be designed and operated so as to be compatible with ideals of human dignity, rights, freedom, and cultural diversity." I like that principle, okay? I'm all for that principle. That's great. But my concern is that Principle 11 gets undercut by Principle 14. So let me explain that one. That's the shared benefits principle. And that goes like this, quote, "AI technology should benefit and empower as many people as possible," end of quote. Okay, so we had a discussion about this in the workshop today about how actually this is a form of utilitarian politics. This simply amounts to saying we want to provide the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And indeed, Tegmark, again, super smart guy, actually says as much. He exactly says this is utilitarianism in his book. Problem here, of course, is that people minoritized, well, any minoritized people are already not in that group. And people minoritized on the basis of SOGI have never, as a group, been amongst that group, okay, of the greatest number. So I think what that tells us is that the underlying politics of the beneficial AI movement is actually incompatible with the underlying politics of SOGI proponents who are looking at trying to help those people who are minoritized and not in that greatest happiness category. Another more general danger, I think, is that the beneficial AI movement, as important as it is, and I actually think it is an important movement, I'm not trying to throw it under the bus, I'm just trying to think about it in terms of SOGI issues. But so it can distract SOGI policymakers by making them focus on the wrong things. So this is because, and I now have a long list of what those wrong things are, but this is because the way the beneficial AI movement functions is it's really focused on a couple of very specific things. So it has a very specific time horizon. Which is it's interested in the future much more than what the future of AI will be or AGI will be, rather than what's happening with AI and AGI right now. So I think that's the wrong time horizon. I think it also can make us think about the wrong problem in relation to AI. AI narratives focus on apocalyptic dangers to humanity versus utopian promises for humanity. And they also focus on AI interests versus human interests, like are the machines really going to terminate us kind of thing, right? Or are we going to become the human pets in the AGI zoo? I mean, Tegmark literally writes about that. And then the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? How happy would we be? Yeah, you got to read this. Anyway, these are take over the world scenarios. And as take over the world scenarios, they're all or nothing. Okay? So this means that what they miss are the incremental applications of AI and the incremental claims that are being made in the name of AI. So claims and applications in the name of AI, I'm suggesting, and my opening illustration I hope shows, are already occurring. And some of them combine bad science and bad technology in the name of good science and good technology, which I think makes them not just technologically dubious, but morally dubious. And that's how I would talk about the Stanford study. Excuse me. Right now, there are other urgent problems and questions that we need to address. Like, what guarantees that AI can help policymakers achieve SDGs and uphold the UNHCR mandate to protect SOGI minoritized people? If there are no guarantees, and that's my position, there aren't any guarantees, then what UN AI policies can help to protect SOGI minoritized people now and in the future? Not just in the future, but now and in the future. So that's the wrong problem scenario. I also worry about the wrong actors issue in terms of what beneficial AI has us think about. For example, the beneficial AI movement assumes that we just need to know what our human interests are, okay? So that we can then program those into algorithms and keep AI safe for humanity. But it doesn't pay enough attention to how humans constantly divide themselves into categories of the fully human, the subhuman, and the non-human. And I think SOGI proponents know that these are narratives that they're constantly fighting against. Wrong applications. The latest call from the beneficial AI movement is to ban killer robots. And they actually presented an open letter to the United Nations this past August with the signatures of all the most influential people in the field. That's great. I mean, by all means, let's ban killer robots. I have no objection to that. But my concern is this. Is that good enough for UN SOGI policy? For the UN mandate to protect? For the UNHCR's human rights agenda? For the UNDP's linkage of inclusion and development? For UNAID's public health policies? I mean, of course it's important to ban killer robots, but the more immediate problem for SOGI policy, the one in my example, is to ban bad applications of facial recognition technology and to consider how these might creep into all sorts of policies around SOGI and more generally around immigration policy, public health policy, and a whole range of security policies. Which brings me finally to my last wrong, which is wrong outcomes. Worries about AI and AGI are very much bound up with their success versus their failure. Is it going to work? Are we ever going to get there? Yes, 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 no, 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 okay? That's what a lot of those debates are about. But even when AI fails, it has an impact on our daily lives, because it feeds our ideas about what might be possible if or when AI maybe eventually succeeds. And so this is something that my colleague at the University of Sussex, Cato Reardon, calls being captured by the algorithmic imaginary. Okay? The argument then would go something like this, that, look, the Stanford study is terrible. It's junk science. It's bad. But what it makes us think is that a better study, a good study, a better application can achieve what the Stanford study fails to do. The problem with that is that kind of thinking is that it doesn't contest any of the assumptions about the biological existence of sexual orientations and gender identities. It doesn't contest any of the assumptions about AI's ability to machine read and machine know people in terms of their SOGI presentation, nor does it do anything to guarantee that AI applications to SOGI issues would abide by international humanitarian law. So I think that that's quite a dangerous thing that could happen. The final danger that I want to talk about tonight is the last one on this slide, which is that we also could very easily forget. I mean, it's certainly in, somebody called it the Geneva bubble. I love the Geneva bubble. But I can see how, things can be forgotten in the Geneva bubble. That we could forget that there are competing AI and SOGI narratives that are at play here. That what we want isn't necessarily what the rest of the world wants, or even other policymakers or actors in civil society. So while there are problems with the AI hope narrative and with the SOGI proponents narrative, I want to suggest that these two narratives, especially in some combination, provide the most positive potential for AI to be compatible with SOGI proponent goals. But AI technological innovation is not driven by those who share either the AI hope narrative or the SOGI proponents narrative. Okay, now let that one sink in, right? We're not leading the show, okay? What drives AI innovations are both the AI freedom narrative, which is the Silicon Valley narrative, which is about escaping government control, and their mantra is can do, will do, okay? So where's the political responsibility in that narrative? You have to think about that. And the AI fear narrative, right? So this is the sort of, for the IR people in the room, the sort of realist power politics narrative, and their mantra is we need to accumulate power to survive. Okay. These are the folks who are actually driving the kinds of innovations that are happening in artificial intelligence, not the people who want to harness those innovations for good. At the same time, the global SOGI proponents narrative is itself in need of some correction and also under attack by some sides. So I think there have been some very important friendly correctives to the SOGI proponents narrative, particularly coming from post-colonial and decolonial scholars. But at the same time, this SOGI proponents narrative is up against the SOGI opponents narrative, right, that says LGBT people are a risk to society, and it's society that must be defended. Sorry, that was too Foucauldian at the moment, but yeah, it's pretty obvious, right? And also, one of the things that I worry about is also the rise of what gets called alt-right nationalist LGBT narratives, which have very different, there's a way in which they call themselves proponents, but maybe they oppose many of the things that other people, UN proponents of SOGI narratives would embrace. My point here is this, that we have to think carefully about how those supporting any narrative about AI or about SOGI would utilize AI. Right? I want to know how the alt-right is going to use AI in a SOGI narrative before I decide whether to embrace it as part of a UN SOGI policy. I want to know how SOGI opponents are going to use it against LGBTI or all sorts of other ways of describing sexually minoritized and nonconforming people before I sort of say, AI is good, AI can do good, AI only does good. Of course it has the potential to do good, but it also has the potential to do lots of harm. So these are my just a few examples of the opportunities, risks, and dangers that AI might present for UN SOGI policies. And I certainly don't have all of the answers for how to fix these dilemmas and problems, but I do have some suggestions about where we go from here. I think what we need is a UN-wide conversation that focuses on the implications of AI for SOGI issues especially, across UN institutions, across UN goals, and across AI and SOGI narratives. So at the moment, I don't know that much about UN institutions and what's going on, but I know that, The Hague does sort of crime and weapons, and ITU has done AI for good and, connected to the SDGs. But, none of that, to my knowledge, has been specifically about SOGI or been a connected up conversation. I think there'd be a lot of benefit from such a conversation. I think that such a conversation might then, end up creating a group like a UN working group. I don't know any of these sort of organizational lingo. I'm an academic. But, you know, a working group on AI and SOGI issues that could much more systematically than I've just done map the opportunities, risks, and dangers of AI for everyone on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. I've only this evening spoken about the risks and dangers to SOGI minoritized people, but there are risks and dangers to non-minoritized people, to majoritized people on the basis of SOGI as well. But so that these could all be mapped, whether AI or AGI becomes a reality, or whether it remains mostly an organizing fantasy of and about individuals, communities, life, and ways of living. And I think that would then allow for the crafting of policy recommendations that could anticipate the right things that we need to be concerned about regarding AI implications of SOGI issues without being distracted by my long list of the wrong things that distract us. Okay? Almost done. So by way of conclusion, let me leave you with this thought. Anybody who's actually working in diplomacy knows this far better than I do, that accurate information is a diplomatic necessity, but a desire for certainty is a diplomatic trap. And artificial intelligence is offering you both. So when an AI robot comes to the UN and offers to help humanity create the future, please pause and ask yourself questions like these as you consider what future you want with AI, generally and in the context of SOGI issues. How does AI actually know? How reliable is AI knowledge? And how might AI-generated knowledge order our relationships, whether those are intimate, national, or international? Who actually benefits from AI? Who does AI actually help? Are specific AI-generated orders, winners, and losers compatible with UN aims and objectives? And how can UN AI policies be written to make sure that UN aims and objectives are met? Okay, those are the kinds of things that you'll have the answers for that I don't. So those are really my comments for today. What I'd like to do is close it here and open up for discussion. And please, I'm very interested in your comments as well as your questions. So I'm happy to try to answer questions, but I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about these topics. That's, for me, the real great thing about coming to Geneva and coming to the Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Okay, we have, I think, around about 40 minutes for questions. Cindy would prefer to take questions one at a time. So,
I have a terrible memory.
So if we have any comments or questions. Okay, so we have one at the back there. Do you want to? So I can't actually see the audience terribly well with these reading glasses.
Thanks for the presentation, Cindy. Just the thought on this would really depend on the impact of AI would in a sense also depend on what we understand by the terms sexual orientation and gender identity. And I want to take you a little bit to the Yogakatha principles and the understanding of sexual orientation as each person's capacity for profound emotional, affectional, and sexual attraction to a person of one or more gender. And gender identity, similarly, each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, etc., etc. The only point I want to make is when the terms are defined in terms of capacity for profound emotional, affectional, sexual attraction, or deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, I don't think the AI phenomena can quite capture what these terms mean. And my sense again is the way organizations have worked till now. Look at the work of the UNHCR. How do you determine if a person is can be a refugee on grounds of so sexual orientation, gender identity, they don't go by surface phenomena. It's not by whether you like Madonna or not. It's not by the way you look or not. It's by more assessment of the profound aspect of it. What is the identity of the person? And that's something AI is, I feel it's too superficial a phenomenon to try and answer that deeper level of question. So my sense, approaching it from a legal point of view, is I would say AI is totally irrelevant to understanding what these two terms are in terms of international law and policy, because it's a surface phenomena. So I'm wondering whether I missed something in the presentation as to whether what the relevance of AI to SOGI is. My answer is that if this is going to be the future, it can't be in terms of the existing framework.
Yeah, so, how does this work? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, you didn't miss anything. The question, so I agree with everything you just said, Arvind. I think that the question becomes what kind of future creeps in without us wanting it? How do terms like sexual orientation and gender identity become translated through AI, so we have an AI-led narrative that pulls SOGI along with it. So and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, this is why I started with the provocative introduction of "Look at me," right? And can you tell if I'm gay or straight? I mean, this is ridiculous. And that machine-readable knowledge, so-called, would exist that can codify that. It doesn't make any sense. The terms, even sexual orientation, have. I mean, they've all been unpacked. They've all been contested. These are very problematic terms. What I think becomes incredibly problematic, and there's lots more in the paper that I wasn't able to present today. What becomes very problematic is precisely what you're skirting around and almost getting to the point of saying the real concern that I have, which is that we go from a situation of saying, I am, okay, so I am a lesbian, or I am a queer person, or I am a straight person, or I am a gender non-conforming person, to you are, and I know for sure who you are because AI told me so. Okay, that's where this leads, and that's why. So to ask the question about the implications of AI for SOGI policy are that all of the kinds of complexities that you're talking about in the principles, the kinds of conversations we have today, the kinds of conversations academics have about these things, they're gone, they're flattened, they're lost, and they're lost because of the can-do, will-do. Kind of narrative of freedom that SOGI potentially offers to a few Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, but not to minoritized people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. They end up having less control of their world than they would otherwise. So the reason why I want to sort of ask the provocative question about the implications is as a kind of precautionary tale. Okay, so one of the things we talked about today also was, what happens when data becomes available to people? It becomes very seductive. Certainty becomes very seductive, and targets get established on the basis of what can be quantified and what can be known for sure. These things about sexual orientation and gender identity and gender nonconformity, they can't be known for sure. I don't even know for sure how to define myself, okay? The last thing I want is some quote-unquote super intelligent machine that's been had algorithms fed into it by an MIT physics professor determining what my sexual orientation is. And then on the basis of that determining what borders I can cross, or what clubs I can go into, or what jobs I can hold, or what health care I can receive, or all of these things. So that's why, so yeah, when you ask the question about, how does it help asylum seekers, I think it's a nightmare. I think it's a nightmare. This is why I try to sort of put it as a question, but I can't be positive about this in any way. So you missed nothing. That was an excellent recap of all of the problems. Thank you.
please.
Oh, sorry. Which one? I guess a comment and then a question. The comment is, for me as someone who works as an activist on LGBTI rights, the cautionary tale for me from this, and it's not, I mean, I guess I'm so far removed from discussions of AI that it's hard for me to take it really seriously as a threat, but the cautionary tale for me is that we have to be careful with how we latch onto the kind of born this way narratives, because they can hurt us as much as they can help us. And I work in the African context, and I do have to have arguments with government officials who claim that people are being converted or people are being recruited. And as a practical, strategic tactic, we have to, in that setting, often come back with, well, no, that's not true. People don't go out and recruit and convert queer people. You know, people have their innate sexual orientation and gender identity, and you can outlaw it and criminalize it all you want, but that's not going to make queer people go away. And so that's a strategic decision, and a lot of movements on the continent have latched on to slogans like "Born This Way," which is useful but limited, right? Because these are concepts that are much more complicated than that. So that's, I think, an interesting thing to think about, but I don't really see the immediate threat from AI. But I wonder if you can tell us, from the discussions that are happening around AI, are there other ways in which it's being used to talk about categorizing people based on sort of similarly ambiguous or broad characteristics that make you think that there is a concern, other than this kind of Stanford study, that it could be that people could take it seriously as a way to categorize people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity?
Okay, let me just write that one down. So on the Born This Way narrative, I mean, one of the things that really disturbs me about Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, is that it completely embraces evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology just is, and that's it. And so again, it's something else I didn't talk, that's one of the assumptions that I'm like, let's just give them as assumptions and we still end up here. But those assumptions are incredibly concerning. And so I agree with that concern. In terms of categorization, I mean, the categorization is, I mean, I think whether categorization happens in terms of what individuals do, what we do offline, or whether it becomes part of big data sets or not. You know, there are histories, there are long histories there of the ways in which these things are problematic, and who is it? Sally on indicators. Who was Meg's? Yeah. The whole way in which categorization becomes a governance strategy for people is a big debate about what the pitfalls of categorization could be. When we go into the realm, and so that's for everybody. When we go into the realm of artificial intelligence, the concerns very quickly, become not only how do people get categorized into data sets, and that data gets fed into through an artificial intelligence algorithm. The worry also becomes then, what are the criteria for making decisions that the algorithm actually uses, and the artificial intelligence, presumably learns and repeats and uses to select people. So, for example, there was a discussion, because I'm not a computer programmer, but some people who are working in AI were having a conversation on Charlie Rose. Okay, one of them is a colleague of mine, Lucy Suchman, and the conversation was about how AI algorithms are being used to decide who is the best employee. Okay, so I want to hire the best, the best employee for Human Rights Watch, and so I'm going to throw all my data into this algorithm, and I'm going to turn it over to the machine. And what the research shows is that AI is actually pretty good at determining who the best employee is going to be. So they'll find somebody who's talented, who is capable, who sticks with the job, who finds it interesting, and actually benefits the organization. The difficulty is the kind of black box within the, from the database to the algorithm to the decision. What these researchers say is that they don't know the basis upon which AI made that decision. So did AI make that decision by throwing out all women of childbearing years? Often it does. Did it throw out all racially minoritized people? Often it does. Depends on what, the fit of the organization. Those kinds of things. Those are ways in which categorizations happen without us even thinking about categorization. And those are things that are happening right now. So I think that those are some of the concerns. And this is baby AI, if we can even call it that, right? It's big data and algorithms. So.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. I also want to thank Neela for this sort of revealing the ways that this Born This Way narrative or the strategic essentialism can, the ways that AI reveals the way that can bite us in the butt, but at the same time, the way that still is as an essential tactic when people use a discourse of recruitment. It's something that people just choose, and so why is it that we have to protect people's sexual orientation, gender identities when they're minoritized? My question is really about the starting point, really, of this particular concern. I'm not entirely sure why we start off at the UN level when the UN. I mean, for me, what's more pressing is starting off at the national level, where countries have a monopoly over who lives and who dies and are able to actually enforce policy via violence. Whereas the UN, it seems to have a lot more soft power. I think maybe through UNHCR at the interface of migration, perhaps that's where policy can then trickle into biopolitical issues. But in terms of the UN as a general apparatus, I don't see where the risk really does lie versus the national.
Okay. Let me come back to the strategic essentialism versus Born This Way. One of the things I want to say there is that in Tegmark's understanding of evolutionary biology, that's not strategic essentialism. That's the truth. Okay? And so that's what I'm contesting. So strategic essentialism is, I'm going to use this at this moment, even though it may or may not be true, because it'll get me this thing that can work best in this situation. So I want to be very clear that those things are very different. Okay, he's just he just embraces evolutionary biology, never contests it. So why talk about it at the UN level? Well, it wasn't my idea. The UN is talking about it. These conversations are occurring, and when I came across the ITU's magazine talking about the AI for Good Global Summit and the ways that AI could help us achieve SDGs, I went, okay. I went, and it's very interesting. There's lots of interesting stuff in there, and there are conversations about ethical dilemmas and concerns that we have. But my concern was that the UN might only think that there's one narrative out there or be captured by one narrative on AI, which is the hope narrative, and that hope narrative is about, so we hope that this can help us achieve SDGs. And actually, the way I started for preparing for this talk was trying to sketch out all the various dominant narratives about AI. And like a complete geeky IR person, I was like, okay, so it's realism, liberalism, and libertarianism. I'm like, they're not going to listen to that. So it's fear, hope, and freedom, and that's kind of what those things are. But we have to be so. So it's because the UN is already thinking about these issues, but thinking about them in a specific way. And then at the same time, I'm sorry, I'm terrible, I haven't learned all my UN acronyms, but the Hague Center that's looking at AI in terms of criminality and weapons, that seems to be the fear narrative, or the hope in the fear narrative, or, I haven't, actually gone through and unpacked that. And I thought, okay, so are they talking to one another? And who they're talking to, I mean, the quote that I read about the convergence of biological and digital life, and that biology, what was the quote? Let me find it because it's just so juicy. I'll never find it because when I'm looking for it. But something about how AI gives us certainty. So biology gives us, a lot of information, but AI gives us certainty. That was a quote from somebody who, a summary of a talk at the AI for Good ITU conference. All right. So if those ideas are what are being presented to UN officials, it seems to me that other narratives need to be presented to them as well. And so that just as you can map the various narratives about AI, there's also the various SOGI narratives as well, and the whole kinds of ways in which, a lot of the things that I didn't present here today are things that I think most of the SOGI proponents people are very well aware of, about how the being forced into binaries, how these terms from sexual orientation onward are very contentious terms, all the things that Arvid was talking about earlier. So I didn't do it, they did it, and I want to sort of complicate that conversation, and I think that, so that's one thing. The other thing is that things always happen at multiple scales. And things always happen not just, one of the things that was so interesting about the workshop today is we had academics, we had, practitioners, civil society practitioners, we had UN officials, we had, other NGO organizations. There are all sorts of ways in which things are happening in minute ways, and that we don't know what's going to happen and be taken up in what place at what time. But UN dialogue about this can lead a lot of things and can trickle down to a lot of those various people without them even sort of thinking that maybe some of this is more contentious than it at first appears to be. It's interesting in some ways to sort of say, like, why are we even talking about AI? Why is this a concern? It actually makes me even more nervous, because AI is the conversation that the people that I know who are working in science and technology studies, the people who I know are working in industry, the people who I know are working in weaponry and killer robots, they're all doing this already. This is the conversation that's driving them. And my concern is that UN officials or other people more broadly working on SOGI issues will be led by what has already been being put into policy. What happens and not actually creating SOGI-specific policy that will engage with some of these contentious ways that AI could be taken up? That's my concern. So what happens, for example, if Max Tegmark's beneficial AI narrative captures the imagination of the UN, which it could very well do. He's got a lot more influence than I'm ever going to have. And then it's kind of after the fact we're like, uh-oh, that was utilitarian politics, and that's not actually going to defend minoritized people. Maybe it's too late. What principles do we have to think about now? I give long answers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the brilliant conversation. My name is Defne Gönenç. I'm a PhD student in political science, and I would like to try to put a fourth narrative onto the table, but a conspiracy theory type fourth narrative. Apparently, AI technology is gathered at the hands of a small elite, and it's also controlled by them. So what risks does this situation pose, particularly when we think that production equation is actually being changed by the rise of the IA technology? Do you see any parallels between, for instance, the rise of terrorist attacks, maybe even civil financing, particularly in the Middle East, and the rise of AI technology, and it's being gathered by a small elite group of people, when we think that capital is actually being less dependent on labor because production equation is being changed, and what are we going to do with the increasing population, plus these people are also consuming too much resources, maybe according to that type of thinking. So what would be, your views about this possible fourth narrative?
So I'm not sure. Let me see if I understand. Maybe we have to have the mic go back. Let me see if I understand the fourth narrative. So am I the conspiracy theorist? Is that the question?
No, I'm a political science student. No.
No, that's okay. I just want to understand. So is the question that I think that a small elite is driving AI and that there's some horrible conspiracy and they're taking over the world?
No, I mean, if the basic question is actually AI technology is making bulk of people in the world waste, in a sense, because capital is becoming less dependent on them.
Oh, okay. So this is about
technology can reproduce itself.
Right.
So we will. So a small group of elite people will not need the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah. This is the Silicon Valley dream, as I understand it. There is a kind of the freedom narrative is a libertarian narrative. It says the market should determine what happens, and there shouldn't be government interference. There should be government subsidy, but there shouldn't be government interference in political decision making, and so the elite, a very small group of people get richer and richer and freer. I think that narrative is part of the freedom narrative. Let me throw out a fourth narrative, which is the "Are you kidding me?" narrative, which is that that AI and the algorithmic imaginary is an imaginary at the moment. There are certain ways in which big data is using algorithms to make decisions. There are things that we don't know, but that robot that can do the house cleaning can't do the house cleaning. That robot who came to the UN, I guarantee you, had all the answers, already pre-coded in the little funny thing it did with its hand. These are not spontaneous thinking machines. Okay, this is an organizing fantasy that has not come to fruition. But my argument was about how even organizing fantasies can make us believe that they're achievable. I mean, one of the things that Tegmark, for example, does in his book, and I'm just coming back to one source because I just think it's easier. As he sort of says, okay, so when will we get AI? And he pools all of his super smart people, and it's from never to in 20 years, but it's never now, right? It's always just a little bit further on. And so the ways in which kind of futuristic projections function, I mean, we can worry about whether or not they're really going to come to pass, whether or not human laborers are going to be obsolete, and we're all going to get basic incomes, or we're going to be part of the human zoo, or whatever it's going to happen. We can debate about the realities of those things, or and I think this is more useful, we can think about the kinds of ways that those imaginaries lead us to think and make us think about what is possible and what's impossible and get on a kind of trajectory that we may not think is a good thing. So, for example, even in the conversation about classification, okay, whatever kinds of, we know historically you can read the literature, that historically classification harms minoritized people. The people who are classified are minoritized people, okay? So whether that's on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or race or ability or class, those things tend to work against people, okay? And when they are classified, they become scapegoated. There are all sorts, there's a whole kind of thing that happens. And guess what? In terms of, the so-called classification of the homosexual, that was all tied to proper science of its day. That was all understood to be the absolute truth. I mean, we go back to, you just got to read, I'm sorry, here he comes again, Foucault, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, The Birth of the Homosexual. Okay? These are inventions, but they are important inventions. They're kinds of imaginaries that have governing effects. And my concern is about the governing effect of an imaginary where sexual orientation and gender identity are things that can be known not just by, people, but now it has to be true because it's super intelligent knowledge. Okay, that's what worries me. That's what worries me. And I think that that's an immediate problem. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting about the Wang and Kaczynski study is it got totally, I mean, maybe some of you read about it, it was totally dissed in the media. And what did Kaczynski do? He doubled down. Instead of saying, yeah, actually, we skewed the sample, we didn't actually check and see what sexual orientations were, he's like, this stuff is real, this stuff is good, this stuff works. And you kind of go, okay, you can hear my accent, it's US. And I've been living in a world where you tell the lie enough times and a constituency follows you. You tell people that there is such thing as a machine-readable sexual orientation enough times, and my brother's going to ask me when I'm going to get my ID card, right? So these things can have consequences in the present in whether or not they actually come to fruition in the future. So that's the idea about the kind of algorithmic imaginary and its potential to organize the present, even in ways that we don't necessarily want to do it. I mean, look, let's go to a SOGI example. Another one is about indicators, right? And whether or not indicators and we start counting people and classifying people, whether or not we're going to find what we're looking for, whether or not that makes people perform particular categories in order to become readable. What happens to those people who are not readable? They become more studied, more surveilled, all these kinds of things. So these histories are these are things that are happening already in the field of SOGI. As they become so complicated or fantastically, so maybe it never happens, but knowable, that it's that will to knowledge, it's that will to certainty. It's that is the diplomatic trap in the pursuit of accurate information, about which maybe there isn't, maybe it doesn't exist.
I think we've probably got time for about three final questions. So we'll take your question first, and then your question, and then yours. Okay?
Thank you very much. My name is Maya. I work for an NGO that is a member of the Killer Robot campaign. So, but without wanting to distract any further, that was intellectually very stimulating. Thank you for this. I agree. The Killer Robots is a distraction. It's also an opportunity, I think, in some regards, given the system for policy making that we presently have. It allows us to draw some lines, not all lines that need to be drawn, but some lines. And in a way, I'm starting to think about it a little bit as a lab as well.
As a what?
As a laboratory. To analyze the imaginaries that are being proposed there, discussed there, the narratives, And very soon, I think, we will see a move towards a broader framing as science and technology advances in the conventional weapons field, security, disarmament more generally. But we will see some of this being reproduced. And I think that framing is perhaps more apt to allow us to challenge more explicitly some of the narratives that are on the table or that are not on the table, and why is that the case? To tackle the ways in which we bridge the present and the future, to question and challenge the transhumanist underpinnings of much of this discussion, and the culture of promises, as someone else has called it, that is very prevalent in this domain. Tomorrow I have the pleasure of being on a panel organized by DeepMind, Society and Ethics. So I think there we can see some beginnings of, willingness on the behalf of some actors to engage with not only what's acceptable or marketable, but what's desirable as well. And so my question, or I would be interested in your thoughts as well, on what is your message to the tech community today? Thank you.
Oh God, what's my message to the tech community? I don't have an answer for that. I'm just going to be honest. Let me think about that. That's a really interesting question. But let me answer the question that I anticipated, which is one I think I'm more capable of answering. Your discussion about killer robots and distractions, but they also become opportunities. I think that what I want to be heard on today is asking a question of the SOGI community, SOGI proponents community, which are what are the opportunities for SOGI policy in relation to AI, whether that's about saying, look, these are the risks and dangers, or these are the opportunities. I mean, I think, going back to the ITU's Global Summit for Good, I think the SDGs do offer opportunities. I think that, the policymakers who we were talking, I've been in conversation with, harness those SDGs very effectively for, sort of the equality, gender equality. There are things that can be harnessed there, but they have to be, there have to be very specific considerations of what these will mean, not just in, look, we can all have more food to eat, or we can produce more food, or we can produce healthier food, or we can eliminate poverty. It's like, well, but what is the organizing political principle of distribution, and how does that affect SOGI minoritized people, or whose health matters, and how does that affect people with HIV/AIDS? Those kinds of very specific questions that maybe my colleagues who are doing this kind of work are already considering, but I just haven't seen them out there in the conversation. So I guess, do I have a message for the tech community? I don't know that makes any difference. I can't think of one that would be heard. But I think in the context of SOGI policy, because that is, these are the kinds of things that I do work on. I think that asking those questions about opportunities and trying to think specifically about implications is a really important thing to do.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the pretty fantastic presentation and a lot of food for thought. So the question that you've tried to answer is, how does AI work? But the question that I have for you, what and who makes AI possible?
Sure.
Because I'm thinking about the reinscription and reproduction of corporate power, capitalist social relations, extraction of resources, which made me think that all the three narratives that you laid out on the table are a little bit environmentally naive. And they assume that we have an infinite amount of resources and cheap labor to draw on, and that, we can just get on thinking about the future of AI without thinking about the limits of our planet and our planetary resources. And to an extent, that conflicts fully with SDG goals and the UNEP mandate and climate change debate. So, if we ask ourselves what really makes AI possible, we kind of come up with a different ways of tackling that debate, which complements, all the problems that you've listed with the indexing, the classifying, the discrimination, and the opportunities. But I think it's really important for us to ask ourselves, who's the kind of cheap child labor in a Congo mine that extracts, the bits of metals that allow our computers to work, and is that desirable for a future full of AI and bots?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's my favorite question so far because I have a Max Tegmark answer to that, of course, right? What Tegmark argues that what makes, he's a physicist, and all he talks about is matter, and that all we need is matter, and we can turn, mass into anything, and all we are is mass. And so he's got this, there's a horrible colonialist, interstellar colonialist fantasy going on in the AI story that he tells about hope, which utterly reproduces the kind of colonial fantasies we've had on Earth. Zero critical self-reflection about that at all. But also, he actually argues that ecological issues are secondary to AI issues because AI will figure it out. Yeah. Well, it's so bad it's good, right? It's one of those. I'd like to hear the question here, if we could.
Yes, certainly, yes. And then we have one final one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did we skip someone?
Yes.
I'm sorry. No. Okay. I want to make sure we get both.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, I
Sorry,
wanted.
I didn't see your hand.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand either, sorry. So I kind of wanted to comment to your question about what should we tell the technologists, and especially people at DeepMind, who we'd love to talk to, because we're convening something with OHCHR about AI and gender next week, and we're been talking to a lot of scientists about how ways to look at this. So I think what I'd like to say to the DeepMind guys is that they're inventing the future. You should remind them about their Marshall McLuhan, that we shape our tools, but our tools shape us. So the tools that they're inventing are what we are going to become, and that they're creating the world that we're all going to live in. And at a certain point, when it gets to AGI, we're not going to be able to bring it back, right? That's this super intelligence. Once you invent the black box, it keeps going, it keeps learning from itself, and nobody can actually undo. So some of the things which I'm sure the DeepMind people know, AI Now, who are out of NYU, suggest that all black boxes be transparent. And I think that that's something that we're probably all going to get around together to advocate for, so that we understand what goes into the black boxes.